To investigate factors contributing to the dramatic declines in trout numbers in recent years, NRDP was allocated $1 million in 24 as part of a revision to our Upper Clark Fork River Basin restoration plans. And that investigation into limiting factors has been nicknamed Where's the Fish?, which has the unfortunate acronym of WTF. And I've hesitated using Where's the Fish or WTF in official capacities, but it has really caught on. So I'm just gonna run with it at this point. And the Where's the Fish investigation has three main components. The first is water quality. The second is fish research. And the third is habitat and geomorphology. Today, you're going to hear some things about the what, where, why, and how are we studying habitat in the upper reaches of the Clark Fork River. I'm going to talk about some of the past, present, and future studies on the Clark Fork River fish habitat that I've been involved with. But first, let's chat a little bit about why are we studying habitat in the first place. I think folks on this call are all aware the Upper Clark Fork River is home to a massive cleanup and restoration effort. This is a recent phase map from DEQ and shows the status of the various cleanup phases. For instance, phase 1 is the most upstream phase. It was also the first to be completed back in 2014. Also point out phase 7 is the phase that's currently in progress. They're out there working on that one as we speak today. And then there's other phases in various stages of design. So meanwhile, as this restoration and remedial activities are taking place, fish numbers in the uppermost reaches of the Clark Fork River are near historic lows. And this is despite considerable progress in both the cleanup and restoration efforts that are taking place in Silverbow Creek and Clark Fork River. And the map on the left shows sampling sections in the Upper Clark Fork that FWP has been doing regularly. I'm going to focus on the most upstream section. That's the PH Shack section. It's just downstream of Warm Springs Creek and Warm Springs Ponds. The graph on the right shows brown trout abundance, which are the gray bars, in terms of fish per mile over time. And brown trout abundance peaked in 2013 at almost 1,900 brown trout per mile, and it's been declining since then, bottoming out in 2023 at 25 fish per mile. Now, that's a pretty massive decrease in just a matter of about 11 years. But this declining trend since 2014 is something that's characteristic of all FWP sampling sections upstream of Deer Lodge. But if we compare that to what their data show downstream of Deer Lodge, we see a different pattern. For example, this is from what's called the Williams Taverner section between Deer Lodge and Garrison. Again, the gray bars here are brown trout abundance. In some years, FWP is actually able to capture enough West Slope cutthroat trout to generate mark recapture estimates for them too. So those are the red bars you're looking at here. But just focusing in on the brown trout, those abundances have been much more stable than what we saw at PH Shack or other sites above Deer Lodge. And not only has these main stem populations downstream of Deer Lodge been stable, but the populations in tributaries such as Warm Springs Creek, Little Blackfoot, and Flint Creek that are also monitored regularly by FWP, those tributary populations have been stable as well. So this population crash really has been limited to the mainstream upstream of Deer Lodge. This is a photo of FWP electrofishing that PH Shack section back in 2013, which is smack dab in the middle of phase 1 remediation. Excuse me. remediation of phase one was completed in 2014. And as we know, during remediation, contaminated soils in the floodplain and in the stream banks are removed. Vegetation is also removed and then replanted along the banks. And this creates at least what is visually a big disturbance and an alteration to bank-related habitat. It is interesting to consider that, right in the middle of this disturbance, the population at this pH shack section was 1,870 fish per mile. And next year, 2014, it was 1,200 fish per mile. This is a photo also from electrofishing, that same pH shack section, a different bend in the river, but same sampling section, this time in 2023. Again, population estimates in 2023 were 25 fish per mile. And now when I'm helping out FWP, electrofish pH shack, or if I'm just walking around phase one, to me, visually, it looks like bank habitat has, partially recovered in the last 11 years. Undercut banks are forming, willows are growing, and there's a good proportion of the banks that were actually preserved in phase one. And that preserved the related overhanging cover and woody debris. But given the dramatic decline in fish numbers and the considerable investment that's been made in cleanup and restoration, we need more than just visual impressions. We need quantitative data to document the status of fish habitat and monitor trends in that habitat over time. And it's critical when we're doing that we're measuring the right variables in the right places at the right time. But how do we even measure the quality of fish habitat? Well, the first method that I ever learned about way back as an undergrad at the University in Wyoming was a method called the Habitat Quality Index, or the HQI. And this is a model that was developed by Alan Binns and Fred Iserman, who are biologists at the Wyoming Game and Fish Department. And back in the 70s, they went out and measured a whole bunch of habitat variables throughout a whole bunch of different trout streams throughout Wyoming. And then they tried to relate or modeled trout abundance based on these variables. They didn't use trout abundance exactly. They used what they called standing crop, which was kilograms of trout per hectare, but trout production nonetheless. And they developed a couple iterations of this model and had pretty good R squared values, greater than 0.9. And the model worked so well that the Game and Fish Department was still using the HQI as recently as the mid-2000s when I was working there. We were still collecting similar habitat data in conjunction to our routine electrofishing surveys. Now, others have tried to use the HQI approach throughout the West with mixed success, and it's almost certainly not directly applicable to the Clark Fork River, and I'm certainly not advocating that we should. But it is interesting to consider that some of the same habitat variables that Binns and Iserman were looking at back in the 70s are relevant to the Clark Fork. For example, they looked at late summer stream flow, and most of you have heard me talk about the importance that has played in the fishery. They also looked at annual flow variation, maximum summer stream temperatures. This is something we know is a major limiting factor to trout in the Clark Fork River. Binns and Iserman, looked at a suite of different habitat quality variables. The one that worked best for their model was nitrite, nitrogen. We also have nutrient and obvious water quality issues in the Clark Fork. These guys also looked at invertebrate production in terms of abundance and diversity. And they also looked at cover habitat. And you'll hear me mention cover often throughout my presentation today. And I mentioned stream flow, and you can't see a presentation from me without me bringing it up, but minimum stream flows were a driving habitat variable for the fishery in the Clark Fork River for many years. And Based on streamflow data from USGS's Galen streamflow monitoring station, I looked at minimum stream flows and how those could predict trout numbers 3 years later. So age 3 recruitment is just simply the number of fish captured in FWP sampling surveys expressed as a percent of average. And what we saw that minimum flows 3 years before were a good predictor of this age 3 trout recruitment. And that went on for at least 13 years. But starting in around 2018, this relationship really fell apart, where stream flow is no longer a good predictor of recruitment. We've had some pretty decent flow years in recent years, but we've had pretty much zero recruitment of small fish to the fish population. Another habitat investigation that I got involved with was one led by Clark Fork Coalition. Alex Leon, in particular, approached me back when I was working with FWP, and working with Alex, we developed some low effort ways to measure habitat variables. So specifically, we're interested in habitat variables associated with cover. We went out and measured the amount of overhanging vegetation and the depth of undercut banks every 6 feet. We also took our measuring stick and went out and measured any in-stream wood that we found. And then we went out and did snorkeling surveys to try to document, the fish species, the size of these fish out there, and associate where those fish were with a particular habitat feature. And we really had some mixed success with the snorkeling. It was a lot of work. It took a crew of 3 snorkelers. We probably could have used a few more in the water. But mainly, the main thing was, in 2019, when we were doing this study, the population had already crashed, and there simply weren't enough trout or other fish species, frankly, in the river to observe enough of them to make these sort of habitat associations. So we're a little bit too late to try to do that kind of approach. We did see some differences in terms of cover habitat among different phases. These graphs show the average amount of overhanging cover and undercut bank depth per 6-foot interval, or per measurement that we took, basically. And these are just the average of all those measurements we took in each phase. The phases that were remediated back in 2019 are in blue here, and the phases that were not remediated are in black. And we can look and see that, overhanging vegetation was pretty abundant in phase 1 and relatively lacking in phase 4. We can also make, a general observation that phase 2, for instance, had relatively low average undercut depths compared to phases. So it's clear that there's a lot of variation between these different phases in the amount of bank habitat available. And the study established that cover habitat metrics could be measured in this sort of quick and dirty way and provide valuable quantitative data on habitat. Although we did look at in-stream wood during that Clark Fork Coalition study, we focused largely on the banks, and focusing on the banks is largely justifiable because remediation, restoration have direct effects, both positive and negative, on bank habitat. Bank habitat is already limited in much of the river due to contaminated soils and lack of vegetation. So by cleaning up those soils and planting vegetation, the process will, in the long run, improve habitat along the banks in those areas. In-channel cover is clearly as important as bank cover, maybe more, when we consider things like deep pools, woody debris, or boulders. And those obviously also need to be considered as part of a thorough habitat investigation. Another big effect that the cleanup has on habitat is through geomorphology and changes in bank elevation and floodplain elevation during the cleanup. I stole these slides from Karen Boyd from the presentation she gave to the Upper Clark Fork Working Group a few years ago. So thank you, Karen. But I thought these slides really demonstrated how the cleanup lowers the elevations of the stream banks and the floodplain. The target currently is to go to a 1.5 year flood interval, a Q of 1.5. And this will lead to more stream energy dissipating out into the floodplain and less stream energy within the channel. This will likely lead to changes in the way that pools and point bars form, for instance. And these changes in channel morphology need to be monitored to make sure that things are headed in the right direction and not trending towards conditions that we wouldn't want. For instance, a river that's wider and shallower. One thing to note is Karen's photo on the right here shows these coir bank treatments, use of these fabric coir logs, which have willows laid down and planted around them. This was one of the main bank treatment approaches prior to COVID. COVID came along with its supply chain issues, and the availability of this coir fabric became really limited. And so bank treatments are no longer employing the use of coir logs at all. And these photos show examples of more recent approaches to building banks. They're so recent, they're from last week out there on phase 7. Photo on the left shows a brush bank, which at least visually will provide more immediate habitat benefits compared to those coir logs. Again, this is something that we can pick up if we do thoughtful quantitative monitoring. And there's also some large wood being used. And also during the design process for phase 7, members of the design team walked the entire phase with Caleb Erling from FWP, who provided input on areas that were high quality fish habitat, areas that could or should be preserved if at all possible during the cleanup of the phase. So as the cleanup has progressed, the approaches to bank treatments and design in general have really changed. And that's taken place from phase to phase. And quantifying the habitat benefits of these different treatments and these different design approaches are important in terms of informing design decisions in future phases. So what is currently being done to quantify habitat, and where are we going next with all this new data? Well, GM has collected a whole host of habitat information on phase 7 as part of the design process. This kind of pre-remedy data collection will be the routine going forward in future phases. And the kind of data GM collected was they used UAVs, they used drones to map bank lines with the help of LiDAR data. They mapped the wetted channel. They also mapped overhanging vegetation and vegetation type. And they went out and mapped or remotely mapped aquatic habitat features such as pools, riffles, backwaters, etc. And they were also looking for in-stream wood. After the remote assessment, Amy Sacre and her crew went out and did field verification of those same habitat variables they were looking at remotely. And they also went out and measured the depth of undercut banks and looked for and documented eroding banks. So this is the type of information that this habitat assessment provides. For example, we have the area in terms of square foot or acres, or also as percent of various habitat features such as backwaters and pools, etc. Not only that, we have the location of those specific habitat features on a map so that we can track changes in these particular features over time. Like I said, this habitat assessment also looked at various types of in-stream wood and mapped those as well. And to complement this current habitat work, we are working with Tetra Tech to gather geomorphic data. These data include longitudinal profiles, which are going to give us things like channel slope, pool depths, pool widths, and pool frequency. And then those guys are also doing cross sections, which are going to give us widths and depths, with the depth ratio, cross-sectional area, and flood prone width. There, I got it out. They're also doing pool cross sections, which again will give us widths and depths, areas. Also going to look at point bar slope and berm slope. Oops. So what else is planned for these assessments? Well, to date, pre-remediation geomorphic data has been collected on phase 7, and the plan is to collect data on previously remediated phases this year. There's pre-remediation habitat assessment report complete for phase 7. And GM has also completed a similar assessment on phase 1 and is going to integrate those results with the geomorph data when it becomes available. So what are we going to do with all this new information? What's next? Well, there's a lot of interest in using these data to help develop targets or objectives or trends that we want to see in terms of habitat and geomorph measurements going forward. And this is by no means a comprehensive list. These are just a few things that I think are kind of the bare minimum of things we want to be monitoring, perhaps set some objectives for. And top of the list would be with the depth ratios. We probably also want to monitor pool counts and morphology. We want to monitor the development of undercuts. But the question is, if we're going to develop some sort of target or objective for these things, are we talking hard targets, fixed numbers that we're trying to get to, or do we just want to see trends? We just want to see things moving in a favorable condition. And whatever the answer is, I look forward to having this discussion with our stakeholders and our partners and trying to come up with what is the appropriate targets for all these variables we're looking at and what we should be doing with all the new data that's being collected. I would also like to see the phase 7 assessments done right after construction and then somewhere down the road as those phases recover, maybe 5 years post remediation. And then, and then continue these pre-remedial assessments on future phases before construction starts. So the final habitat component I'd like to focus on is stream temperature. And on the right here is that same aerial photo that I had on my title slide. You can look at it and I think most people will come up with their sort of own assessment of fish habitat, the quality of the habitat. You might see things like pools, riffles, overhanging vegetation, side channels, backwater. But an important feature you cannot see in these true color images or with our naked eye is that of water temperature. And so the work of Maggie Olson and Raja Negassetti at Montana Tech is shedding new light on the thermal conditions and thermal refuge habitat in the Upper Clark Fork. The photo on the left is from some preliminary work that was funded by George Grant TU and Clark Fork Coalition in 2023. That was done by Montana Tech. And since then, with support from NRDP, Montana Tech has been collecting pre-remedial thermal imagery on all of phase 7. They did some flights in summer 2024, and they're actually out doing flights this week to document the thermal conditions during springtime in the same phase. And looking at some of Maggie's preliminary images, it's striking to me how warm water is getting during the summer. You know, temperatures are exceeding 19 or 20 degrees, which are clearly stressful for trout. It's also striking how much variation that they're finding in water temperatures at relatively small spatial scales. And that really does, you know, highlight that there's small areas of thermal refuge that are probably important in the Upper Clark Fork River. And those thermal refuges are things that we need to be taking a close look at so they can be maintained or enhanced in the future. So you've heard a lot over the last 20 minutes or so about me rambling on habitat and geomorphology, but habitat is just one of the 3 factors that we're focusing on as NRDP is working with our partners to investigate the low fish numbers and develop strategies to reverse that trend. We're working with Caleb and his crew at FWP who are expanding efforts to study why there are so few small trout surviving in the Upper Clark Fork. The photo in the middle here shows one of Caleb's screw traps, which they had out in sort of a trial basis last year in the Clark Fork River, just downstream of the confluence of Warm Springs Creek. If you happen to see that out there, it's a pretty weird looking rotating trap. FWP is working with MSU on developing a graduate project. It's likely going to involve fish cages. On the water quality front, NRDP, FWP, and DEQ have been working with USGS to expand their water quality monitoring and research efforts on the Clark Fork. Glad to see Travis joined us today so that I could embarrass him with this photo on the right of Travis Schmidt presenting some of the new water quality data analysis at last year's Clark Fork Science Forum. Now, I don't have time today to give the fish research or the water quality studies to do them any justice. So I'm hopeful that Caleb and folks from USGS can come give us an update on those projects on future brown bag presentations. So just a plug to get more people to come do these brown bags. And to leave you, I'm just going to leave you with a embarrassing photo of myself and my contact information. I do want to give a shout out to Jessica Banaszak at DEQ for providing me a very recent update of the phase map at the last minute, and also bending over backwards to help Montana Tech and the thermal drone imagery people get access to phase 7 as it's under construction. So thank you everyone for listening, and I'll take questions.
Thanks, Nathan. For everyone in the audience, you're welcome to unmute yourself and ask a question. You can also, there's some way to raise your hand in Zoom. If you figure that out, you're welcome to use that. Or if you put a question in the chat, I'll try my best to monitor that. Nathan, I have a question to start with. The collapse of the fishery mainly describes the trout population. But there are some other fish that are still present in large numbers in the Upper Clark Fork. And so do those other species use habitat differently? Are they perceiving this disturbance and this ecosystem in a different way?
Well, I haven't asked them, but I would say that they likely are. They have different life histories and different habitat needs. But when I say we haven't asked them, I'm joking because we don't have as good of a handle on what those needs are. And it's much less clear, to me at least, how any disturbance up there or water quality issues or the like could be affecting other species. I mean, anecdotally, we have seen fewer non-trout species up there than in the past. And Taylor Gold-Quiros has done some work to show that whitefish numbers have gone down in concert with trout numbers. So it's likely affecting more than just trout, but it's difficult to make firm conclusions, especially about the small-bodied fishes that we are not sampling or even seeing on a regular basis.
Thanks. Vicky, if you want to ask your question, I see you've raised your hand.
Yeah, a couple of quick questions. One is, I wondered to what extent the levels of filamentous algae are included in the habitat assessment, and also if you will be hiring any temporary summer workers to help with the assessments. I'm always looking for jobs for students.
Two great questions, Vicky. The work that we're doing is not explicitly looking at algae or even, substrate. I think that I'm not smart enough to monitor that stuff as well as you have in the past. But I think it's really important. I know that folks at the university have been doing a lot of work on algae in recent years as part of the cruise project. So I'm going to leave it up to the experts on the algae front. Of course, if you have any recommendations on things we might need to add to this assessment, I'm all ears and I'd love to hear it. In terms of summer help, there you go. I just you put the call out not only to myself but everybody else on this call. So get a hold of Vicky if you're looking for some help doing field work this summer.
We're about to summarize a bunch of the recent algae work, so I'll be sure to get that to you.
That's great. Have you seen any trends, recent trends, any changes to speak of?
It's the upper river is so tied to how high the spring scouring flow was. When there's a big spring scouring flow, it cleans the river out for a year or two, and then it grows back, of course. So that's probably the biggest factor in the upper river. And we've not seen a whole lot of improvement in the upper river the way we did down in the middle river. The middle river really responded to Missoula's tremendous cutting back of nutrient loading, but the upper river is still struggling, even though Butte and Anaconda and Deer Lodge have all tried to do things to reduce their nutrient load some.
Well, I know that we're still really interested on, what effects of those algae blooms have on the fishery itself. I know that Maury Vallette did some research on changes in diet during algae blooms that was interesting, but we don't fully understand if those algal blooms are a net benefit or harming the fishery.
I think probably their main negative effect is their effect on oxygen levels at night. Even though they help to pump the oxygen level up during the day, they pull it way down at night. And I think, is Caleb been doing a lot of diurnal DO measurements?
He's been doing a lot, and he's been focusing a lot on Silverbow Creek. I know that FWP is shifting their focus now in terms of their DO monitoring to the Clark Fork River. So I think maybe we should gather up as those guys are putting together their sampling plans with you and make sure it makes sense and we're capturing the variations both over time and space and algae in a way that makes sense. So let's revisit on that if you're willing to talk about it.
Most definitely. Thanks.
Thank you.
Mike Sanctuary, I see you've raised your hand. Do you want to ask your question?
Thanks, Sam. Yeah, thanks, Nathan. Interesting presentation. I guess I'll just hop onto that. question that Vicky just asked there. It'll be interesting to see with the lowering of the floodplain elevations and the dissipation of energy at those higher floods, whether or not the reduced scour on the bed that's going to result from an increased floodplain connectivity is going to have an effect on the algae. But that was just a side note. But my question was, you indicated during your presentation that you're looking at establishing either specific targets or just documenting trends with that geomorphic data collection, sort of an as-built and then a 5-year after construction. And I'm curious to know if your partners that you're working with on developing the monitoring plan have come up with any specific means of how you would establish targets. Like, are you gonna use like a similar river that has good fish population trends as the basis for possibly setting some of those targets, or something else? So just curious if you can share what you've thought about so far in terms of what would be the basis of setting some specific targets, if any.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, and something that we've talked about a lot for a long time now is what can we use as reference conditions for the Clark Fork River? And no one up till now has come up with a really great answer to that question. I do believe it'd be worth looking at other similar rivers, other parts of the Clark Fork River again, as we're trying to come up with those targets. I'm of the opinion, but we need to do our homework before we make those conclusions. I'm the opinion that trends might be more valuable to look at if we're coming up with targets for all phases. Because I think our references, or the appropriate reference, if we could come up with one, would change from phase to phase as well. So I'm the opinion that trends might be more useful, but I'm open to input, and I'm looking forward to having those discussions with our partners.
Great, thanks.
Nathan, there's a couple questions in the chat. The first one, what has been happening with the macro invert community?
Oh, that's a big question. And it's something that USGS has been digging into. Sort of broadly speaking, the macroinvertebrate community has shifted from a more metal tolerant community. So suggesting that metals have been going down over time, to a less metal tolerant community. And while that's been happening, another subset that Dan McGuire and his predecessor, and Stagliano, who took over McGuire's work, used another subset, which they call the organic subset, which is sensitive to organic pollution. That subset has become more dominant, showing more of an impact from organic. So I think what we've seen is, as metal concentrations have gone down, albeit slightly, in the Clark Fork River, we're seeing more metal intolerant invertebrate species, and it's showing more of a signal of nutrient pollution. Did that get at your question, the communities, or were you talking more about abundances or a specific species? I guess.
Sorry, you didn't hit it. It was also sort of abundances. If you had seen, or if like Dave had seen, a decrease in abundances as well.
That's something I haven't seen thoroughly dug into, but the data that is out there that I've looked at has not seen any shift in abundance on a sort of gross zoomed out level. That's a great question though, because again, it's strange that the bug community seems to be telling us that things are getting better, at least in terms of metals, and we're not seeing impacts to their abundance, whereas the trout and fish community is showing a completely different trend. And that's one of the reasons why the WTF acronym I think is appropriate.
One more question from the chat, Nathan. Can you see any information about the algae in the remote sensing data?
Yes. There was a student as part of the cruise project that was using remote sensing to map algae in the Clark Fork River. I use satellite imagery to do some remote sensing of algae to try to document where the blooms occurred and where they were not as heavy throughout the Clark Fork River. And there's been other efforts over time as well. So it's a perfectly good application of remote sensing, especially now with drones becoming more and more sophisticated and readily available. So I think there's still a lot of room to do that kind of work and answer various research questions.
Joe, I see you've raised your hand. Do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, thanks. And Nathan, a really great presentation. It gives me a lot better understanding of where the fish are studies are headed. I wanted to comment on the Dave Stagliano, Dan McGuire studies, and the nutrient part. The way it's expressed in their reports, it's nutrients or fine sediment, and so it could additionally be it could point towards there's less with lowering of the banks, there's less energy in the stream, and it could be that we're just seeing more fine sediment in the bed.
Thank you for that, Joe. I also recall them mentioning that it could be also be reflecting dissolved oxygen conditions. So it's, it may be reflecting a whole suite of different sort of conditions, including sediment or oxygen or nutrients. It's not specific to nutrients. So thank you for pointing that out.
We've got one more from a participant under the name Deer Lodge. Go ahead and ask.
Hey everyone. Oh boy. With DEQ. I'm not quite sure why I'm Deer Lodge on this. I don't know what happened there. I just wanted to say, first of all, great job, Nathan. And then just with people talking about remote sensing, we are looking into incorporating more remote sensing into our monitoring for silverbow from kind of the super fun aspect. And depending on how that goes, we're probably going to do that on Clark Fork as well. So if there are things that people are hoping to see or think should be considered in doing that, I'm happy to take any feedback because this is kind of new territory for us. But ideally, we'd be collecting possibly more than annually high quality aerial imagery for the entirety of silverbow. So just letting people know.
Thanks, Jessica.
Mike, go ahead.
Quick follow-up question for you, Nathan. Saw one of those first slides that showed the historic kind of highs and lows of the fishery in terms of fish per mile. And I think that slide showed something around 1,600 to 1,800 fish per mile was sort of the high numbers back in 2013. ish. Yeah. So
1870.
yeah. Okay. So yeah. You know, if we use that as kind of the high point in the last 30 years or so, I guess my question is like, is 1,800 fish a mile considered good? Is that a good number for like regionally speaking, or is that still considered really low, or is that sort of in the middle, or a high density of fish relative to other productive rivers like the Big Hole or the Gallatin or Blackfoot or you know, I just was wondering kind of how those numbers, how those highs and lows are relative to other regional rivers.
Yeah, that's a great question, and brings up something I didn't fully mention in my talk. At 1,800 fish per mile is, you know, higher than average brown trout density. That said, there's certainly reaches of those other rivers that you mentioned that have even higher trout densities, those, you know, true blue ribbon streams. You know, the average fish per mile in this PH shack section, you know, prior to the crash was about 900 fish per mile. And that's pretty close to what we figure is average for other nearby streams, somewhere around 1,000 fish per mile. And that's also what we sort of use as a number of what trout density in the Clark Fork River would be, would it not be for, you know, metals contamination. So anything higher than 1,000 fish per mile is above average, and below that is below average. And every other sampling section in the Clark Fork River has not averaged 1,000 fish per mile. It has much lower fish densities than PH shack section, and much lower densities than virtually any other comparable river in Western Montana. So I hope that answered your question, but 1,800 is pretty good. It's not the best, but it's pretty good, especially for a stream the size of the Upper Clark Fork.
Yeah, thanks for that. I was trying to kind of figure out a way to maybe tie that to your trying to develop monitoring success targets or trends, and that's a big question that you're trying to get at, I'm guessing. And I guess, you know, that data right there shows me that, you know, maybe looking at all the data, you got your highs and your lows, but if you're somewhere on average about 1,000 fish per mile with the existing morphology there, that means that morphology can support those fish numbers. And so maybe your morphology numbers, if you know, should basically be trying to show trends over time that are supportive of fish habitat and fish numbers. So if those numbers there are showing that the habitat was there at that time to support that number of fish, and that morphology remains over time, then the habitat's not the limiting factor. At least the geomorphic numbers that show habitat aren't limiting. And that there might be something else going on water quality wise. So just to try to kind of connect the dots there between matching trends in morphology monitoring metrics versus trends in fish population metrics, there might be a opportunity to generate a link there.
Yeah, and I'm all for linking habitat to the fish, letting the fish tell us what good habitat looks like. And that's part of the reason I wanted to bring up the HQI, and part of the reason I talked about the snorkeling is oftentimes that's what we need to do is let the data and let the fish tell us what good habitat is, so that we can start teasing out what particular components are most critical.
All right, we're almost out of time. Let's take one more quick question from Lisa and then wrap it up.
Hey, Nathan, great talk. I wanted to ask, because thinking about your reference, it seems like it's pretty strong trends with flow. So instead of thinking about like a reference condition, thinking about deviation from what we know happens with flow for each year, right? Because flow is going to be changing over time, and maybe setting a new carrying capacity for that system. So thinking about not like what was it before on, you know what I mean, but just thinking about like what we would expect based on your kind of fish flow relationships that you've already developed for each year as you're trying to understand, like, are we getting what we might expect? Does it, in terms of habitat, like what more can habitat do, may be limited just by the carrying capacity set by flow. So it might be, instead of thinking if we're in more and more drought, you might not be failing in terms of restoration if you just have a lot less flow, right? So thinking about setting the stage in terms of that carrying capacity driven by flow that you've already kind of explored and shown might be a reasonable way to think about success. Because we may or may not be seeing flows like we've seen in the past in the future. So just a thought, just based on the work that you've done in the past, a way to set up how you might gauge success for in-stream restoration. But things you can control based on things you can't control. Or things that come with a different, not in-stream habitat, but water leasing and other things. And it's just a thought, throw in the mix.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. In an ideal world, we would come up with another HQI type multiple regression model that captures all those critical aspects, and flow would certainly be on the list. But it is something we do need to keep in mind in terms of carrying capacity, because it, at least in the past, really drove the whole system. And so, the residuals around that line are kind of where we have room to play, I think, in terms of habitat.
Thanks, Nathan. That was incredibly informative, and the discussion was really very constructive. So thanks a lot, Nathan, for taking the time to put this together and share it with us. And thanks to all the participants for your engagement here. As I mentioned at the beginning, we will have the next seminar on Wednesday, April 16th. If anyone has any ideas about any speakers they'd like to hear from or any topics that they would like to see covered, please let me know. You can reach me, sam@clarkfork.org. And with that, we are officially out of time. So thanks again, Nathan, and hope to see everyone next month.